I don't know if you've ever been in a state of despair, but if you ever have been, it's a terrible place to be, to feel as if there's no hope, there's no way out. People who get in that situation often are desperate, often cause harm to themselves. But God doesn't want you and I to despair. Even in the worst of situations, He wants us to understand that there is hope and that there is God and there is eternity. And I think as I thought about this, I thought about Paul, and I'm going to speak about Paul some tonight. There's a quote got me on this sermon. It says, there is a point when the anguished soul finally despairs, a moment in life when the heart, the will, even the spirit crumbles. Some say that after much grief and drowning in tears, it is possible to pick up the pieces and carefully repair what was shattered. I say nay, for the chains of despair have no key, and the soul destroyed by that monster can never hope to be unaffected. There are things done that cannot be undone. And I think that's true. There's things that can happen to your life that can't be undone. I hope that you never have to go through some of those things in your life, but they're faith-changing moments. There are times in our life where we decide if our faith, what it means to us. When people go through these times in their life, they either come out with a deeper faith or they lose their faith. I've seen both things happen in my life. I've seen people here that have gone through terrible tragedy, that unbelievable things have happened to, and I've seen them be faithful and look to the Lord and remain in church and remain faithful, even though they've had terrible tragedy in their lives. But I've also seen people here who have had terrible tragedy in their lives who, although I thought would never, ever lose their faith, would never quit, they couldn't recover. They couldn't understand. They couldn't not blame God. They could not blame things. Maybe it's hard sometimes, isn't it, to reconcile tragedy in your life with God and with why does it happen, right? We ask the question, why? And yet there's really not a good answer, is there? Why sometimes things happen to certain people, tragedy befalls certain households, and yet others seem to remain unaffected. I remember years ago, we were many years ago actually, in the old building over here, and there was one time that all the men were getting up and talking about our lives and talking about things that had happened, and I remember, and I'm not going to use a name because it actually still goes here, but one guy got up. Of course, we were all young then. That's been, 30 years ago, 20-something years ago. And he says, I've just been blessed. There's nothing really bad that's ever happened in my life. My children are all healthy. My parents are still alive. I've never really had what you would call a major tragedy in my life. That's a blessing, isn't it? To think I've never really had that happen, that terrible, terrible thing happen. I've never received that awful phone call in the middle of the night. I've never had to watch that. Never had to go through that. But I would contend that none of us are immune. And you never know tomorrow. So the question is, how do we keep faith when it seems like we're in a state of despair, without hope? In Acts chapter 9, as Jesus called Paul, the apostle, into ministry, I always think it's a fascinating thing that Ananias has to come and tell Paul. The Lord said to him, "Go to Ananias, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles, the kings and the sons of Israel." But listen to 16. "For I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake." That's not really a good way to get somebody to volunteer, is it? Right? I mean, to say, let me show you how much you're going to suffer. And I've always wondered, how did he show him? Right? I mean, how did he show him how much, and did Paul really know how much he would suffer for the name of Christ? I don't know. But I know that he did. Paul says he was whipped, scourged by the Romans. It's a flagrum. That's the whip. If they put metal in it, it's called a scorpio or scorpion. They didn't always do that. It's an instrument of torture. The picture in front of you is of an American slave that actually had been whipped, and it shows you how brutal. We see it maybe in Passion of the Christ, but to see the scars, to see how brutal it is. Under Roman law, you could only whip somebody not over 40 times. So they always said 40 save one, because they never wanted to make the mistake that they miscounted. So the Roman scourging was 39 times. You know, we see that in the Passion of the Christ, don't we? Do you know the word flagrum in the Latin is where our word fillet comes from, like to fillet a fish? It's actually the root of that word. That's how brutal this is. You know, Paul, we see Jesus being scourged, don't we? Paul says 5 times. 5 times I received 39 lashes from the Jews. Now, the Romans could whip you as many times as they wanted. The Romans could whip you as much as they wanted. But under Jewish law, it couldn't be over 40. So 5 times he received 39 lashes. They were so, the Jews were so particular about the law that they didn't want to make a mistake and go over 40 because they thought that would bring divine retribution. So they always did 39. 5 times he had happened to. 5 times. Can you imagine that? We look at Jesus and we say Jesus was scourged. We see the Passion of the Christ. We're like, oh my, how terrible that is. 5 times that happened to Paul. 5. Can you imagine what his back looked like? I can't even comprehend that. It says 3 times I was beaten with rods, and that's Roman punishment. In Acts it says I was beaten many times. The one time we had that account in Acts, it says he was beaten many times. There was no limit under Roman law. They could beat him as many times as they wanted. And the word rod here means scepter or staff. It's a rod, a pole. And they would beat them with them poles. And many times, I was looking this up, and historically, many times people died after just being beaten once. They would die from this punishment. That's how severe this was. 3 times Paul was beaten with rods. It says, I was shipwrecked, right? Remember that in the book of Acts? I spent a night and a day I've spent in the deep. I have been on frequent journeys, in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I've been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, and hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Apart from such external things, there's a daily pressure on me of concern for all the churches. I don't know what Paul looked like when he finally went, when Nero finally executed him. But I think if you'd gone through that, you would probably be a shell of the man that you started out to be. I just can't believe that you could walk upright. I can't believe that you wouldn't hurt every morning when you got up. I can't believe you wouldn't feel it every single day of your life. You couldn't feel the scars on your back, right? The bruises, the beatings, the cold, the exposure. I've read medical doctors try to say how bad a shape Paul was, and, of course, I don't know how they know. It's not like they can examine him. But they said, given his age, given the time, given what happened, he would have been in terrible, terrible medical condition. And yet Paul continued to press on towards the gospel. In 2 Timothy, which is the last book Paul wrote from the Tamartine dungeon in Rome, at the end of his life, he said, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. He was forsaken. For Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me, gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia. Titus to Dalmatia. Paul said, in spite of everything I've gone through, it's not just my physical torment, it's my mental anguish. It's the fact that the people who were close to me have deserted me. They're no longer with me. He told Timothy, he says, bring my cloak. Can you imagine how he hurt in the cold? We often say how we hurt in the cold if we got arthritis and we're old. And as we get older, the cold hurts us. Can you imagine how bad Paul hurt in that dungeon in Rome, chained to that wall in the cold? And yet Paul, in all of that, he wrote encouragement, didn't he? He knew God. He knew his Savior. He knew that it was going to be okay. In Romans 12:12, Paul says, rejoicing in hope, persevering in tribulation, devoted to prayer. You know, I often think, if I would have went through what Paul went through, I don't know that I could have been Paul. I really don't. You know, we talk about the punishment of the apostles and how they died and the terrible deaths they died, but it seems like Paul, above all, he had in a way, a miserable existence, didn't he? He traveled every place he went, it seems. He was beaten. He was stoned. He didn't bring that up. We know he was stoned in the book of Acts. He was left for dead. My. You know, I often look at him and I think, boy, what have I got to complain about, right? Following Jesus for me, compared to Paul, I've had an easy road, right? But yet this man suffered so much for the sake of the gospel. In Philippians, he says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is a good repute, if there is any excellence and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. It's an amazing verse, isn't it? What gets us through what's bad? To dwell on what's good, right? I know sometimes that seems cliche, doesn't it? When something's going on in somebody's life and you're like, but count your blessings. And you're like, I don't want to. I want to revel in my misery, right? I really don't want to count my blessings, you know. I don't want to do that. But the truth is, it's at times that when we're in our deepest turmoil, our deepest trouble, we need to dwell on what's good. Dwell on God. Dwell on those things that are important. I remember, and every time I think of this verse, I think of this, and Dawn is here, but when I broke my back and I got to the hospital, I told them my back was broken. I was laying on the gurney, and Donna Lovell came in to see me, and she said this verse. She said, whatever's pure, whatever's noble, dwell on these things. You know, it's easy sometimes when we're in our misery, when we're in our suffering, to dwell on ourselves, to dwell on our pain, on our misfortune, on our lack of blessing, if you wanted to look at it that way. But the truth of the matter is that Paul says to dwell on what's good. How did Paul get through what was bad? He dwelt on what was good, didn't he, in his life? The things that were right, the things that were noble, the things that were pure, the things that were worthy of praise. He dwelled on those things, not on the things that were bad. He says these things, and listen to what he tells them. He says, these things you've learned and received and heard, and listen to what he says, and seen in me, didn't he? You've seen this in me. Practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Practice these things. To dwell on the noble things in our life, the good things in our life, the pure things in our life, the things that are worthy of praise, right? The things that are worthy of praise in our lives. Dwell on those things, because there is that in our lives. Even in the darkest moments of despair and in the worst trouble that we can go through, there's still things that are worthy of praise. There's still things that are noble. There's still things that are honorable. You and I have to think about these things. In Hebrews 10, therefore do not throw away your confidence, which is a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. Don't throw away your confidence. I was speaking to one of our young people the other day, and I said, you know, and she was questioning faith, and that's good. And I said, you know, when you're young, I don't know, faith is different. When you get old and you live, it changes you. It changes your faith. When bad things happen and you live through terrible things, it changes your faith. Because you either have to lean on God or you have to lean away from God. You either have to decide God's the answer, God's the end result, God's where my hope is, God's where my confidence lies, or you come to the conclusion that God somehow has forsaken you, that he's left you and somehow he's punishing you, or he's looked at you different than somebody else. And we do that because we're human. We look at other people and we say, why did that happen to them? Why did that happen to me? Why did I have to go through this? That's a hard question. I don't have a good answer to give you. I just know that you have to take every day in your life as a blessing. You have to look at things around you and give your flowers to the living and hold on to the things that are close to you, because tomorrow's never promised for any of us or any of the ones that we love. Tomorrow's just a gift of God. And I would wish nothing terrible to ever happen to you. I'd wish for you never to have to go through the terriblest thing you can possibly imagine. But I know the reality. Trust me. I know it can happen. You know, where's our faith? Where's our confidence? Where's our perseverance? Where are we at? I think that's an individual question, and it's hard to answer. It's one of those questions like you ask somebody and you think, it's like somebody says, well, if a bus was coming and a child was standing in the road, I would jump out there and push them out of the way. You don't know that until the child's standing in the road and the bus is coming. You don't know what you'll do. Nobody does. Do you? You don't know. It's that way when tragedy happens in our life. How am I going to respond to that? How am I going to deal with it? How am I going to overcome that mentally and spiritually? How am I going to deal with trials and things that happen in my life? And Paul says, dwell on things. The Hebrew writer says, don't throw away your confidence. Don't let it shake your faith, who you are. Understand that God is still in control, even in terrible things. In 1 Timothy 4:10, he says, for this we labor and strive, because we have fixed our hope on the living God, who is the Savior of all men, especially of believers. For this we labor and strive. We fixed our hope on the living God. That's where we fixed our hope. Without Christ, without God, there is no hope in this life. What causes despair? Despair is no hope. Despair is no hope. When you reach a point of despair, you don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. You don't see any way out. You don't see anything good. All you see is what's bad. All you see is your pain, your suffering, because it envelopes us. It like the darkness, it overwhelms us. And in that darkness, the light is Jesus. The light is God. Sometimes that's the only hope that we have, the only confidence that we have. Paul, if you ask him, you say, how'd you do that, Paul? How did you go through all that? How did you endure that? Why did you endure that? Why didn't you just quit? Why didn't you just forsake it? You know, I think when I think about Paul, the fascinating thing to me is here's a guy who left the lap of luxury to endure this. You ever thought about that? I mean, he had a pretty good position. He was pretty high up with the Jews. He went to Damascus. He had a company credit card, really. He could do whatever he wanted. He had a bunch of people with him. He was in charge. He had a good life. He was educated. He had a good position. He probably was fairly wealthy at that time. He gave up a lot to endure this. He could have kept that life, couldn't he? He could have kept that life. And Jesus came to him on the road to Damascus, and Jesus says, go show what he'll suffer. Go show what he'll suffer. And I promise you, if Paul wasn't sure of the reward, the eternal reward, there's no way he would have went through what he went through. There's no way. Who would? Who would do it? Nobody. But Paul knew that it was worth it. I have fought the good fight. I love this in 2 Timothy 4. And this is the end of Paul's life. This is almost the last words we have of the Apostle Paul. Almost the last words we have. And Paul says, I fought the good fight. I finished the course. I've kept the faith. You know, I think at the end of our life, if we can say that, we've done good. Don't you? We've done good. I finished the fight. It is a fight, isn't it? I fought the good fight. It is a fight. I finished the course. I've kept the faith. In the future there's laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all those who have loved his appearing. You know, when I think about Paul, I'm thinking, did you ever despair, Paul? Did you ever, when they were beating you, when they were flogging you, when they were scourging you, when they stoned you, did you ever think, it's not worth it? Why am I doing this? Why me? I don't think he ever did. Because he knew in the end, it was all right. And you know, I think, how do we know? How do we keep the faith? How do we keep from falling away when terrible things happen in our lives? It's because we know we have our hope fixed, our eyes fixed on Jesus, and we know that's the only hope in this life we have is him. And if we lose that, what's left for us? Nothing. To lose your faith, to give up. I pray it never happens to any of us in here. But you never know what you're going to face in life. And you have to prepare yourself. You have to be ready so that your faith can endure whatever hardship might befall you. Because we never want to lose eternity. We never want to lose God. Sobering thoughts, I think. Sorry. Maybe kind of a depressing sermon. Sorry. But maybe something to think about. If we can help you in any way, won't you let it be known while we stand and sing?